lecture on Sharia law. And as I mentioned, when we did Rukhsa and Azima, these are just some terms which deal with the law but really don't have any good place to place them in the Usool al-Fiqh, so we just sort of stick it in the end. And this is the terms of ada and i'ada and qada. Remember when we were discussing the obligatory, the wajib, and we said that the obligatory or the wajib can be categorized into three categories. Who can remember those categories? Time, person, and settlement. Okay, and in terms of person, in terms of time, it refers to as what are the two categories? Latitude, right? Which is al-wajib, al-muwassi', right? The name for it, right? And then when there's a fixed time, it's called al-wajib, mudayyaq. Okay. So when you do an act of worship during its time, okay, it is called ada. When you do the act of worship within its time. Within its time. So, when the performance is within its time, it's called ada. When it is repeated, when repeated within its time for some reason. I mean, it's repeated because it was not done correctly. It was not sahih initially when you did it. So it then therefore it's repeated. This is known as i'ada. And when the act of worship is done after its time, it is known as qada. Now, the qada would be when it's done after its time because either it was done incorrectly initially or because, for instance, one did not do that act of worship whatsoever. He fell asleep, right? He was working all day long and he got home, fell asleep on the couch and missed Maghrib prayer. Got up and it was midnight. Okay, so his praying of al-Maghrib and Isha is now referred to as qada. Okay, he's a new Muslim. He doesn't pray correctly. It's still within the prayer time. So somebody sees him praying incorrectly, teaches him how to pray. His second praying is called i'ada, and you do the prayer correctly within its time. For instance, it's called ada. And that applies for any other act of worship which is linked to time. Yes. No, because when it's repeated within its time, it becomes i'ada. When the initial time, when it's, maybe I should put the initial performance, okay, within its time, that's called ada. Maybe that makes the definition a little bit more distinct. Okay. All right, so with the conclusion of those three terms, huh? Stop. Huh. Okay. It's upside down. All right. I must be getting old with this new technology and stuff like that. Right. So now we have completed this definition. All the constituent parts for Sharia law. Sharia law is a divine address that pertains to the acts of the morally obligated and consists of a demand, an option, or a declaration. Yes? But, yeah, okay, go on. No, it does, because, for instance, you can take, like, the voluntary prayer. If it is in your habits, if you are habitually praying witr prayer, every single night, throughout the year, you pray your witr at the last of the night. And one day, you get up late, so you don't just miss witr, you also overslept and you miss fajr, and it's sunrise. Well, we know that we have to pray fajr prayer. We have to make the qadha of fajr. Can one now make qadha of witr? Yes, according to the strongest opinion of the scholars. Yeah. It's described like that. I mean, it's described with that description. But basically, this pertains to the obligatory acts. I mean, some voluntary acts are described that way, yes. No. The qadha just means that you have done it, but it does not mean that you have received any reward, and you still might have entailed sin if there was no reason for you to have delayed it after its time. The only time a person receives the reward is that, as the hadith said, that if a person falls asleep or forgets, and then upon remembering or awakening does the prayer which he's missed, he receives his full reward if he does it at that time when he remembers or awakens. But this is provided that your falling asleep is not due to negligence on your part. I mean, you stay up all night long, right? Fall asleep a half an hour before Fajr. That's not what it applies to. But it applies to that if just something happens, it's not something habitual. Yeah, I mean, yes, I've seen people who've done that. I mean, even though not from a Pakistani family, but I mean, Muslims, do sometimes do all their prayers at the end of the workday and so forth. That doesn't mean that they have not done anything which is sinful. The best they can hope for is that the obligation to do the prayer, right? That the prayer is, in other words, by them making up the prayer, doing it after its time. So the obligation before Allah to do the prayer has been fulfilled. That's the best they can hope for. Okay? But it doesn't mean they've received any reward for that prayer. And it doesn't mean that they have removed the sin for delaying the prayer and praying it after its time. Even though they know something. Right, I'm saying the best that they can hope for. I'm not saying that they definitely have removed that obligation before Allah. I'm saying the best that it can be. All right. So, I would imagine that somebody could tomorrow, when I'm in Scotland, right, write a paper, maybe a group of brothers, explaining the definition of Sharia law as an exercise. Those brothers who've been taking good notes could probably sit together, right, for a couple of hours and put a little handout, which can then be photocopied for their other brothers in the class, right, regarding Sharia law. Is that a strong enough hint, or do I need to assign But I think it's a good exercise that, we've taken these notes now, right? So we should be able to put the definition of al-Hukm al-Shar'i, right, the Sharia law, and then we should be able to break down the constitution parts, talk about the lawgiver, talk about the acts of the morally obligated, what is taklif and so forth, talk about the demands, the four demands, the wajib, the mandub, the mubah, and the makruh, and the haram, talk about the option, the mubah, talk about the different declarations, and all the different categories and so forth, right? I'm sure 3-4 brothers who were taking good notes sat together, they could probably, over a day or two, put something together. And that way, you'll have learned that topic well, which is the idea, I guess, of coming to the class. It's not a requirement, but I just think it's a good measure of how much we've learned. Okay. Now that we have finished in our course study, remember we said we had the introduction, and then we had the lawgiver, and now we just did the Sharia law. So we've done 3 parts, and now we're sort of like in the 4th part of our course, which are the sources of Sharia law. Or that's one way of looking at it. That's the way we're breaking in our course. But if we look at it in our definition, there's another way of looking at the issue, what we're going to be studying now, is that we're actually studying the address itself, right? The actual address. That's another way of imagining it. But for the way that I broke up the course, the heading is the sources of Sharia law, the 4th heading in our course. Or the actual address itself. Basically, the sources of Sharia law are many, because the scholars differ concerning the validity of certain sources. What we're going to do for the purposes of this course, that we're going to discuss 3 sources where there is unanimity regarding its validity in its essence. Although some of the specifics of these sources, there is a difference of opinion regarding the validity of certain specifics. Those sources being the Qur'an, the Sunnah, and thirdly, the Ijma'. We will discuss Qiyas, which the majority of the scholars consider a source of law, but we will discuss that under the section of the interpretation of the law, which is the next section. Okay, the book which I'm using as a guide for teaching this course, the textbook that I'm using, discusses Qiyas in this section, so therefore I'm just following the author's work. The sources of Sharia law that we were going to discuss, I said, are 3: the Qur'an, the Sunnah, and the Ijma'. I think it'll probably take us about 2 lessons to finish all these 3, or maybe 3 lessons. So we probably will just do the Qur'an, or maybe just part of the discussion regarding the Qur'an tonight. Okay, so let us start with the Qur'an. Regarding the Qur'an, there are a number of issues, legal issues, regarding Allah's book. Let's not forget, we're discussing the Qur'an now in a legal viewpoint. We are not discussing it from a theological standpoint, like whether is the Qur'an Allah's literal word or not, right? The Salaf, of course, the opinion of the people of the Sunnah, have it that the Qur'an is Allah's literal word. Some of the variant sects, look at the Qur'an as an expression of Allah's words and not being His literal word. We're not going to be discussing that matter. We're not discussing the Qur'an in terms of the specific regulations within the Qur'an. And for instance, what does this surah command or what does this surah prohibit? We're not looking at it like that. We're not looking at the Qur'an in terms of the adab, right, or the manners and the etiquette that one must have when dealing with the Qur'an. That's a different issue. What we're discussing is the Qur'an as a source of Sharia law. Okay? So this is the perspective we are studying the Qur'an by. And in that, there's a number of issues. First of all, they normally give a general definition to the Qur'an, being that the Qur'an, in a legalistic, as a source, if we want to define it, is Allah's literal speech, or words, you could say, sent down to the Prophet Muhammad which we worship Allah through its recitation and is conveyed to us by tawatur, which I'll explain in a moment. And is written in the Masahif. Okay, what does this definition include? It is Allah's literal words or literal speech sent down to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, which we worship Allah through the recitation of these words. It is conveyed to us by tawatur. When something is conveyed, it can be conveyed by two means. One is called tawatur, two T's, and one is called ahad. Tawatur means something which is conveyed by so many chains of transmission throughout its conveying, and that it ends with something dealing with the senses, and so therefore it precludes any possibility of any fault in transmission or any lie to have been transmitted. Yes. In written. Oh, masahif. Yeah. I kind of. I don't blame you. I can hardly read. All right. Masahif. I'll explain what that means. Okay, what does tawatur again refer to, right? It means something which is conveyed in so many chains of transmission, all right? And it ends in something regarding the senses, okay? That it precludes any possibility of any error in transmission or that a lie was transmitted. So the Qur'an is mutawatir in its transmission to us in the sense that so many people transmitted from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, it ended in something which deals with the senses, which is actually what he spoke, right, which was heard, that it precludes that what has been transmitted to us, as there is an error in the transmission, or that something fabricated against the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, which he did not say was transmitted to us. Being what, in this case, being him saying that Allah revealed to me these words, these are Allah's words. Now, when something transmitted is not of the degree of tawatur, it's referred to as ahad. Okay. So in ahad, a lie could be transmitted, and also a fault in transmission, some error, something erroneous could be transmitted. Now, it's conveyed to us by tawatur and is written in the masahif. The masahif is the plural of the Arabic word mushaf, which I imagine most of us know. The mushaf is the actual Qur'an, right? The actual written Qur'an is called a mushaf. Masahif is the plural of that word. That's the definition of the Qur'an. Yes? Well, to prove it, you would have to show a non-Muslim, right, that it was conveyed by so many chains of narration, which, unless, the non-Muslim was willing to sit with you and... Yeah, they are. But don't forget, the Qur'an was written, codified, in a text, written text, very early, after the Prophet ﷺ's death. And so therefore, the proof of the issue of its tawatur, right, deals only with just those first few years until the time of Uthman, when he sent the 5 masahif out to the different, or 6 to the different provinces. Yes. That's right. I don't recollect such an incident. I mean, that doesn't preclude it having occurred. But I don't seem to recollect this incident, so it needs some investigation too. There's no number. Some people say 40, some people say 10, but there's really no number. It's whenever something occurs and it's transmitted with such frequency that it precludes any lie having been originated and being transmitted, or something be translated erroneously, and it ends with something that deals with one of the senses. In other words, something was touched, heard, smelled, seen, tasted. Huh? No, it's higher. Yeah, it's the highest. The highest possibility of transmission of knowledge is by tawatur. Remember when we said that knowledge was two types? What were the two types of knowledge? Huh? Right. Necessary knowledge, right? And acquired knowledge. Acquired knowledge is something which you have to establish the proof for in order to show its soundness. Necessary knowledge is something which is determined by the senses, right? In the sense that you see something, you don't need a proof for its establishment, right? You have to do some sort of rational argument to prove it. You taste something, you touch it, you smell it, okay? And likewise, when something is conveyed to you by tawatur, all right, it is from the necessary knowledge. It doesn't need a proof and evidence to show its soundness or its validity or its reality. No. So let's just try to stick to the topic anyway. So, the point is that the Qur'an is transmitted to us as tawatur. Okay. Now, let us, the next point we want to discuss. All right, there are certain recitations of the Qur'an which are conveyed to us not in tawatur, but which are ahad narrations. Ahad narrations. In other words, they are not in agreement with the mushaf, some of these narrations. Or, excuse me, not narrations, but recitations. Let us, first of all, let us mention what are the conditions for a sound recitation of the Qur'an. Well, in order for a recitation of the Qur'an to be sound, it must have fulfilled these conditions. It must be in agreement with the text of Uthman's Mus'haf. 2, it must agree with the Arabic language. 3, it must be conveyed with a sound chain to its narrator or reciter in this case. Reciter, so we can try to use the terms of difference in the hadith. It's reciter. Okay? And some people add a fourth condition that it must be conveyed in tawatur. Okay. So, a recitation, the initial mushaf written by Uthman had no diacritical marks, none of these fathas and kasras and dhammas, right? And had no dots upon it. And let me give you an example. A couple of days ago during Salat al-Maghrib, I don't know if anybody noticed, but the Imam who was reciting the Qur'an was not reciting according to the narration or the recitation which I just led in Salat al-Maghrib. He was reciting according to the recitation of Warsh upon Nafi'. And one of the differences is that they do not say Maliki Yawm ad-Din, but they say Maliki Yawm ad-Din. Malik, which is the narration, recitation which most of you probably have memorized and which I used when I was leading Salah. Malik is written in standard Arabic now like this, and it means owner. And Malik is written like this, and it means king. Okay? Both recitations are confirmed upon the Prophet ﷺ. He recited Surah Al-Fatiha in both ways. Sometimes reciting it Maliki Yawm ad-Din, which means the owner of the Day of Judgment, and other times reciting it as Maliki Yawm ad-Din, meaning the King of the Day of Judgment. Now, the Mus'haf written by Uthman was written in an Arabic style that when looking at the word, you can read in it both Maliki and Maliki. How? Because in classical Arabic, they would not write the alif for the word. Okay, that's why if you open up your Qur'an now, you'll see it written like this. Okay, and you'll see a small alif written between the mim and the lam to indicate to you that since this Qur'an is written according to the recitation of Hafs upon Asim, to recite it as Maliki. But if you bought a Qur'an written in Morocco, or printed in Morocco, right, because they don't normally write Qur'an by hand anymore, okay, it will not have that small alif over there because it's written according to the recitation of Warsh upon Nafi', which is the recitation of the people of Medina, and the recitation which most of us use, the recitation of the people of Kufa. Now, the point is that there are lots of other words, okay, in the Arabic language which the writing of the Mus'haf of Uthman allows for that. One is, just to try to think of some examples, is in Surah Al-Kahf. Remember, as I said, in Mus'hafs of Uthman, there were no dots, okay, like before, after a letter. So let us put this word, okay, I'm going to put the dots for sheen, okay, yushrik, right? You can read this yushrik or tushrik, okay, means no one is, so the verse says, and no one is associated, وَلَا يُشْرِكْ فِي حُكْمِهِ أَحَدًا. The verse in Surah Al-Kahf says, and none is associated in his judgment. Okay? According to the recitation of Hafs upon Asim, which we recite in Surah Al-Kahf, and none is associated in his judgment. It's an information that nobody judges with Allah. Another recitation, I think it's a recitation of Ibn Kathir, but I'm not certain, recitation of people of Damascus, has it recited as, when he would, it's recited as tushrik, do not associate anybody, as an order, okay, a command in the judgment of Allah. Now, the Mus'haf of Uthman, having no dots to it, right, allows you to read it in both ways. Okay, and many other examples of the different recitations. Yes? Doesn't the same rule apply to what both mean? No, one is an information by Allah that none associates with him in his judgment. He's informing that there is no other power that associates with him in what he judges and decrees. And one is a commandment to you human beings. Do not associate anybody in his judgment. Do not judge through another law, for instance. Yes? He will both. Because the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ said the Qur'an was revealed upon 7 letters. 7 ahruf. 7, yes. Yeah, and that's why when you come to my tafsir class in Washington, D.C., sometimes I indulge the brothers by saying, according to one recitation, it means this, and your translation would then should say this, and according to another translation, meaning recitation would mean this, and your translation should say such. No. In fact, what it does, the numerous recitations add more meaning to the Qur'an, and so therefore, it makes the meanings more stronger. I mean, it adds to the beauty of the Qur'an, this is a point. It shows us, the sadness of us living in these later generations, where earlier when people used to memorize, scholars would have memorized the various recitations and so forth. It would add a beauty to the Qur'an, but now you can hardly find a person who memorized the Qur'an at all, according to one recitation, let alone memorize it according to multiple recitations and know its explanation and so forth. No, in the Mus'haf of Uthman, it was written like this. No, it was written in a way so for ya and ta, because these dots were only introduced much later, and just like the dhamma and the kasra and the fatha were introduced later only when people lost the Arabic language, and as a result, when it was written like this, in that case you could read it as a ya or a ta. But what happens if somebody tried to read it as a ba or a na, a noon? That would make a problem in the meaning. So when people, because they didn't know Arabic, a lot of non-Arabs entered into Islam, and the time from the Prophet's period of his lifetime passed, and so even the Arabs themselves were not. They said, well, let's put these dots, make sure people don't start going away from the correct recitation by reading it incorrectly. So let's continue with our conditions, okay? So therefore, a recitation must be in agreement with the text of Uthman's Mus'haf. It must be in agreement with the Arabic language. In other words, it cannot have something which grammatically is incorrect. It must be conveyed with a sound change to its reciter. In other words, if somebody says that Ali ibn Abi Talib, or Ibn Mas'ud, or Ibn Abbas, or one of the Prophet's companions heard the Prophet recite the Qur'an in this manner, that must be correctly conveyed, okay? And the fourth condition is that it must be conveyed in tawatur. Okay? And so therefore, of the numerous recitations of the Qur'an, 7 recitations, the 7 recitations have nothing to do with the 7 letters, okay? Don't get that confused. 7 recitations fit the definition of the Qur'an. All right, and of those 7 recitations, some scholars add 3 more, so it gives us a total of 10 recitations. And each of these 7 narrators have 2 narrators upon them. So in another sense, 7 times 2 equals 14. So for instance, what we recite now, if you look at the back of your Qur'an, we recite it upon Hafs, upon Asim. Asim is one of the 7 reciters of the Qur'an. And we recited Hafs upon Asim. The people of North Africa recited from Warsh upon Nafi'. And Nafi' was in Medina, and Asim was in the city of Kufa. And Asim's recitation goes back to Ali ibn Abi Talib, for instance, and some of the other companions of, it's mentioned back in the Mus'haf. Yes? In fact, who has a Mus'haf? Let me just read what. I want an Arabic Mus'haf, not one of these translations, which might not have it. Does it have the... No, I mean an Arabic Qur'an. Yeah. Because it's in the back of it, just to recite it for the brothers so we can... Okay? It says right here after Surah An-Nas, it says that this Mus'haf was written, and also the dabt, the diacritical markings of like the dhamma and the kasra, according to what agrees with the narration of Hafs bin Sulaiman upon Hafs bin Sulaiman bin al-Mughira al-Asadi. Asad is his tribe, okay? Hafs is his name, Sulaiman is his father's name, Mughira is his grandfather's name, al-Kufi, from the city of Kufa, upon Asim ibn Abi Najud al-Kufi, who was a tabi'i, okay? Who took it from Abi Abdurrahman Abdullah bin Habib al-Sulami, who took it from Uthman ibn Affan Ali ibn Abi Talib, Zayd ibn Thabit, Ubay ibn Ka'ab upon the Prophet ﷺ. So that is the Senate of our recitation, okay? Now, as far as its writing of the letters, it was taken from, it says, okay, what the ulama of the writing of the Qur'an took from those masahif which the Khalifa Uthman ibn Affan sent to the cities of Basra, Kufa, Sham, and Mecca. So here's the agreement with the text of Uthman's mushaf, and the one that he left for the people of Medina, and the one which he left for himself. And those masahif copied from those. Okay? And in particular, according to what was written by the two sheikhs, Abu Amr al-Dani and Abu Dawood Sulaiman bin Najah, and choosing the second way of writing upon the first when there's a difference. Okay. And so then, therefore, it talks about, for instance, as in terms of diacritical marks, it was taken from the marks invented by Khalil bin Ahmed and his followers, instead of the marks of the Eastern Muslims, instead of the marks written by the Spanish Muslims, the Andalusian, and the Maghariba. And then it tells about the numbering of the verses. It was taken from the numbering of the people of Kufa, according to, as numbered by Abu Abdurrahman Abdullah bin Habib al-Sulami, who took it from Ali ibn Abi Talib, and so forth. And then also, you know, about the where you stop in the recitation and so forth, it was taken from a Shafi'i. So this is how the Mus'haf is put together. Before that, about the marks, for instance, like in the Eastern way, the Eastern Muslims, we write the letter Qaf with 2 dots on top, and we write Fa with 1 dot, right? The Spanish Muslims and Andalusian, before when they used to exist, right? And the Maghariba, they write Fa with 1 dot, but they write Qaf with a dot on the bottom. Okay. Yes? In terms of the Qur'an? Yeah, it is said that there is a copy of the original Qur'an written by Uthman, one extant, now in, well, it was in the Soviet Union. And that's what somebody told me when I was here, but I haven't come across that myself. I mean, I haven't read the article myself. And then later on in Russia. And that's because it was in the city of Bukhara, and when the armies of the Tsar took Bukhara about 100 and or maybe 20 or 30 years ago, they took it with them to their museum or whatever in Moscow. And if you look at one of the military agreements or the military, it was like some between the Russians and the Ottoman Turks, there was some sort of stipulation that they would not touch or tamper the Mus'haf of Uthman. It was one of the peace treaties or accords between the two countries. But there's also some Musahif which are written, not the original Mus'haf written by Uthman, but there are some Musahif written, copied from that original Mus'haf, which are still extant in Yemen and elsewhere. No. Yeah. Well, there's a very funny story that one scholar from Mali, a great scholar, reading according to the recitation of Warsh, he led Salah in a Bedouin hamlet in Arabia, and he read it according to his recitation, which is the recitation of Warsh upon Nafi'. So after Salah, the Bedouins were very angry. Who is this guy reciting the Qur'an in a sort of a funny way? And so they were angry at him, and he said, this is the recitation, telling him this is the recitation of Nafi'. And so Nafi' means that which is useful. And so the Bedouins replied to him, La nafa' Allahu lak, may Allah bring no use of you. So it can happen. And also, in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ Bukhari, one time one of the companions recited Surah Al-Furqan according to a recitation which the Prophet taught him, and Umar had not known that recitation, and so Umar dragged him to the Prophet ﷺ for tampering with the Quran. The Prophet ﷺ told him to recite, told Umar to recite, and he said, both of you have done well, because he taught them both to recite that surah that way. Okay, but we want to get to the matter of Usool al-Fiqh, brothers. So it must be in agreement with the text of Uthman's Mus'haf. It's agreement with the text of Uthman's Mus'haf. It must be in agreement with the Arabic language, the grammar, right? It must be conveyed with a sound chain to its reciter, as we saw in our chain to the 4 companions, right? And it must be conveyed mutawatir, which is conveyed by so many chains that it precludes any possibility of a lie or an error in transmission. So what happens if this condition is not there? It is not part of the Qur'an. But then does that recitation become a source of legal law? Can we use it then? And this is a difference of opinion between the Usooliyin. Okay, so we have a recitation of the Qur'an, which is not conveyed to us by tawatur. Can we then use it to bring some sort of additional information, additional legal point? It's not number 4, it's number 12. Okay, so the translation given in this translation, if the man or a woman whose inheritance is in question has left neither ascendants or descendants, meaning neither forefathers or children, but has left a brother or a sister. So the verse says, has left a brother or a sister, according to the recitation by Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, he recited the verse, has left a brother or a sister from the mother. So, a brother or a sister, Surah 4, verse 12. Sa'ad ibn Waqqas had this addition to it from the mother, min al-umm. And so therefore, some scholars will not accept this as a legal proof because it doesn't fit the condition of tawatur. All right? This was just a single recitation. It was not conveyed to us by such a tawatur. All right? However, though, another group of scholars will consider this to be, even though not part of the Qur'an, to be a legal proof, and so therefore it would add an additional meaning to that. So it adds an additional meaning to that. All right? Yes. Those who do not... they say that it's not part of the Qur'an because one of the conditions for the Qur'an is that it has to be in agreement with the text of Uthman's Mus'haf, and it has to be conveyed to us in tawatur. This time, min al-umm, these additional words, is not in agreement with the text of Uthman's Mus'haf, nor for us it wasn't conveyed in tawatur. They say it's part of the revelation, but they say we cannot include part of the Qur'an because it doesn't fit the conditions of the Mus'haf itself. No, it's not. The other scholars say that perhaps this was a tafsir by the companions. And so therefore it's not a legal proof. That they were just explaining the meaning of the verse. Yeah, there's another, but I was trying to find the passage number, the verse, when it says that you should fast 6 days. Ibn Mas'ud, in his recitation, had the word, he used to recite it, mutatabi'at, which means consecutively. So therefore it would add the condition that if you were to say it's a proof, that when a person fasts 6 days, he must do it in consecutive order, as opposed to the other opinion, which would say that you could do it either consecutively or not. I think I'll try to look at the actual verse number to provide it for you. We're going to have to, Which is the stronger? I mean, I'm not in the position to say which is the stronger of the two. Just to know that that there are two arguments, and so therefore some scholars would add legal judgments based upon those recitations which are ahad, okay, and one might then therefore add another legal judgment. Okay, Jazakallah khair. It's time for salah. So inshallah, I'll see you all, I guess, on Sunday, right, or Saturday, right? Subhanakallah. Okay, assalamu alaikum. Alhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ba'd. Continuing in our discussion on the sources of Sharia law, we discussed the Qur'an in the last class, its definition, and we also discussed the ahad readings. Can anybody remind me what was the ahad readings, and what did we conclude regarding their authority as a source of law? And I apologize, my voice won't get much better than this. First, what is it? Or better yet, it was that recitation of the Qur'an which did not have the fourth quality of a tawatur, right? We said that for a reading to be included in the Qur'an, it had to fill how many conditions? 4 conditions, which were? Right, it must agree with the way Uthman wrote the Mus'haf. Second condition? Must be in agreement with the rules of the Arabic language. Third condition? Right, we should have, that recitation should be by a correct chain of narration from us, or from the time it was compiled, to the narrator from the Prophet's companions, to the Prophet ﷺ. And the fourth condition, it should have come through tawatur, which means so many modes of transmission that it precludes any possibility of an error in the transmission or a lie being transmitted. Now, if the Qur'an, the recitation attributed, does not have the quality of tawatur, or secondly, if it does not agree with the Mus'haf of Uthman in terms that it has additional words, and so therefore doesn't agree with the way the Mus'haf was written, then this is considered to be among those readings which are ahad, okay? And as a result, the scholars have differed as opposed to the legislative value of those readings. One group of scholars do not accept that as a legal evidence, in that it's not part of the Mus'haf, Qur'an. Another group of scholars argues that since it has been confirmed that that companion recited the Book of Allah in that manner, we therefore must accept that it is part of the revelation which Allah gave to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And so therefore we can use it as a legislative proof. The other group of scholars who do not accept it as a legislative proof argue that perhaps the intent here by his recitation means his explanation of that verse. And so therefore by the addition of words, or by the fact that it was not transmitted in a tawatur, right, mode of transmission, that the implication is that this is his interpretation. And many of the narrations, or many of the recitations which are attributed to Ibn Mas'ud, that first body of scholars say that when it says in the qira'ah, or the recitation of Ibn Mas'ud, the intent is in the interpretation of Ibn Mas'ud, radiallahu anhu. Is that clear? Is there any questions regarding that? Yes? Well, it's both, because let us not forget that initially the Prophet ﷺ did not compile the text of the Qur'an as a single mushaf. Yes, the Prophet ﷺ did command the writing of the Qur'an, and the Qur'an was written on different parchments, on pieces of leather, pieces of bark, on pieces of bone, whatever materials they had for writing. And the Qur'an was basically for the first, let's say, 20 or 30 years, or even less than 30 years, 20 years, maybe for the first 15 years or so of the Prophet's, after the Prophet ﷺ's death, was not existing in a actual single book which was distributed to the Muslims. A number of events occurred. The first occurred during the time of Abu Bakr. Abu Bakr lived 2 years after the Prophet ﷺ, when a number of those people who had memorized the Qur'an had died, were killed in the battle fighting the apostates. And the fear was that if those people who had memorized the Qur'an were to die, the book of Allah would change or be lost like had happened to previous scriptures. So they approached Abu Bakr, and at first Abu Bakr was hesitant as to compiling the Qur'an in a single mushaf, arguing that since the Prophet ﷺ had not compiled the Qur'an like that, then they shouldn't compile the Qur'an in that manner. Then Abu Bakr was convinced, and Abu Bakr and Umar went to Zayd ibn Thabit, and the first beginning of writing the text of the Qur'an began at that time, during the time of Abu Bakr, within the first year or so after the Prophet ﷺ's death. And the next event that occurred was during the time of the Khalifa Uthman radiallahu anhu, when during the Battle of Azerbaijan, or Azerbaijan as we call it in English, which is to the north of Iran, towards between Iran and Chechnya, in that section of the world. The Iraqis and the Syrians argued concerning the text of the Qur'an, because initially the Qur'an was recited in 7 modes of narration, 7 modes of recitation, and the Arab tribes, when they settled in the different provinces that was conquered by the Muslims, certain tribes recited the Qur'an according to certain recitations, due to that being in correspondence with their dialect, their tribal dialect. So the Iraqi army was reciting the Qur'an in one manner, the Syrian army was reciting the Qur'an in another manner, and they were unaware that the Qur'an was revealed in more than one mode of recitation. An argument occurred. So word was sent back to Uthman radiallahu anhu in Medina to quickly complete the process of standardizing the text of the Qur'an, so that there would be no disagreement in the Ummah. Because the first signs of disagreement were occurring. Even though, it was maybe some, I think the Battle of Azerbaijan was the year 21 after the Prophet's death. It was just within 20 years or so. The Sahaba was still alive. But because this new generation coming in was not aware of that, there was some discord, and so to close the door regarding that. Anyway, so what happened was, Uthman ibn Affan began to write the Qur'an. He commanded Zayd ibn Thabit to write the Qur'an, and the text of the Qur'an was produced, and copies were made and sent to the major cities of the Muslims, as we read that time from the back of the Mus'haf. And that initial writing of the Qur'an did not have markings to it, neither the diacritical markings, nor did it have the dots that we recognize, those letters which are similar to one another in their style of writing, like the ya and the ta. The ya having 2 dots below the line, and the ta having 2 dots above the line. But now we have a question now. Those recitations, which do not fit the text written by Uthman radiallahu anhu, or have not been conveyed to us in a mutawatir mode of transmission, because the Qur'an, those 7 narrations, or recitations, have been conveyed to us in so many chains of transmission, it precludes any lie or any error in that recitation. It precludes a lie having attributed to the revelation sent down by Allah to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and it precludes an error where somebody adds a word to the text or deletes a word from the text, because it's been narrated by so many. And as we said, that the tawatur mode of transmission provides knowledge, certainty of knowledge, right? Just as knowledge is gained by the senses. And let me give you an example. I've never been to the city of Rome. Well, at least I have been to Rome, so let's think of another example. I've never been to the city of Munich, But yet, knowledge that there is a city on the earth called Munich is transmitted by tawatur. So therefore, it provides knowledge, a certitude of knowledge, that it doesn't need investigation. Nobody has to now establish proofs that there's a city on earth called Munich, okay? Because it's been transmitted so much of its existence, okay? An event, World War II. I was not living during the time of World War II, but that there was a war called World War II, or titled that thereafter, and such and such occurred. Okay, Pearl Harbor was bombed, for instance. London was bombed, or whatever. Okay, it's been transmitted by so many modes of transmission that it precludes any doubt of its existence as a historical fact. Right? Now, so then the question comes now with these ahad readings. Okay, even though the chain of narration is correct, we can prove that those people who said that so-and-so said that so-and-so said that the companion of the Prophet ﷺ recited this verse in this manner. Okay, how do we interpret that now? It doesn't fit the criteria set for the Mus'haf, in the sense that it doesn't fit the writing, which employed by Uthman. It deviates from that. And also it wasn't transmitted to us in a mutawatir form. So what do we do with these? Do we accept them as a legal proof? I mean, it's not part of the Qur'an in the sense we do not worship Allah by them. One cannot now use this and recite it in prayer. That's to agreement. But the question is a legal issue now. What is the value of that? Scholars are two opinions here. One group of scholars say that they cannot be used as a legal proof because it does not fit those four conditions for the Qur'an. So it's not Qur'an. Another group of scholars said, while it is not in the Qur'an, it is still what Allah revealed to the Prophet ﷺ, because we cannot ascribe a lie to the Prophet's companions. And that to say that it was not such would mean that the companion of the Prophet ﷺ was either lying against Allah or the Prophet ﷺ. And this is an impossibility. Because it doesn't fit the rasm, the writing of Uthman. The counter argument to this, right, and this is probably which is the best counter argument, is that the term, when they used to say the word qira'ah in the qira'ah of Ibn Mas'ud, it means in the interpretation of the recitation of Ibn Mas'ud. In other words, Ibn Mas'ud would have interpreted the verse in this way. So those additional words, okay, or those synonymous words, was part of Ibn Mas'ud explaining Allah's scripture, and was not part of him trying to say this was from the scripture that Allah sent down to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There's a difference. Yeah. I can't make that decision for the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Huh? I mean, that's a strong opinion. I mean, and I personally, when I was taught the issue, I feel more comfortable with the first opinion, saying that it is not a legal proof, and that when they say it is in the recitation of Ibn Mas'ud, for example, it means in his interpretation of the recitation. But the fact that the debate exists, and the fact that there's a group of scholars who understand that to be part of the revelation, and based upon that, will make a legal deduction, or they'll extrapolate a legal ruling from that, cannot be overlooked. Because when we're studying Usool al-Fiqh, we're studying law now, right? And so therefore, when a scholar is going to use one of these recitations to make a legal decision, we have to understand on what was his reasoning for that. Yes and yes. No, because we're saying that the ahad here, we're saying for those which are sahih. That's true. And some recitations where the isnad is also fabricated. One of the problems is that because the narrations, the chain of narrations, are so early, so the issue of these long chain of narrations of 5 or 6 or 7 narrators, which you have in the hadith, does not exist with the recitation of the Qur'an. You're dealing with basically 1 or 2 or 3 narrators. So the time span is so short, it's not an issue. Yes? Well, that's the debate. That's the debate. How do we now interpret? We've come now centuries afterwards, and we find a book that's in the Qira'ah of Ibn Mas'ud. Did that mean that Ibn Mas'ud recited the Qur'an like that? Or did it mean that Ibn Mas'ud interpreted the Qur'an like that? The question about the value of the word Qira'ah as recitation or interpretation is an issue. Anyway, there's a whole science concerning the science of the Mus'haf. Okay, which inshallah ta'ala, if I come in the summertime and teach the course, we maybe do that. We don't want to belabor the point too much. No, they have other arguments. They say that, for instance, one of their arguments they use is that Uthman unified the ummah upon one recitation, upon one reading. If we say they accept, both groups of scholars accept that the Qur'an was recited upon 7 letters. Okay, and so what they argue is that Uthman, in order to prevent the division of the ummah, right, unified it upon one of these letters, and that these other recitations represent the other 6 letters. Okay. Not political reasons. You might say not for political, because there was no political thing, but it's for a religious, to preserve the unity of the community. And so they say that, for instance, Uthman unified it upon the dialect of the tribe of Quraysh. And they argue that initially Allah revealed the Qur'an in these 7 letters. That's the way to translate it, for the 7 types of recitations. The reason why was because the Arabs had different dialects. Arab tribes spoke differently. And in order to allow for the Qur'an to spread amongst the Arabs, Allah, as a means of mercy, sent it down in the 7 types of modes of narration. Then afterwards, when that first generation of Arabs had passed and the Qur'an became memorized amongst the people, there was no longer a need for these other variant dialects, because the dialect of Quraysh became the standardized dialect. And so therefore, these 6 letters were not included in the Mus'haf, which was written by, or commanded by Uthman to write. And what Uthman did, if you look at the narrations, is that they burnt all other texts of the Qur'an that was available. Anybody who had a text other than that was burnt. And perhaps if there's a copy of Sahih Bukhari upstairs, we can just maybe photocopy that incident, or maybe I can send a student upstairs to. If you look at the Sahih Bukhari, the book of the Mus'haf, the Tafsir of the Qur'an, I think it's volume 4 or 5. About the gathering of the Qur'an, it's a long hadith. Just photocopy those pages for the students. Okay, we'll take one more question regarding this, and we have to go on. Yes. Oh no, I mentioned that. I mentioned that before. Was that what we have to distinguish is that the 7 readings that we talk about now, and the 3 additional readings, okay, are not these 7 letters. They're not these 7. All these 7 readings go back to the Mus'haf of Uthman. So, it's understood by that group to be all one letter by that group. Okay. According to one opinion, according to the other opinion, they're comparable. So, anyway, it's a very long issue, and it's also very interesting, and we could talk a lot more. But unfortunately, the scope of the lecture, the course, does not allow us to go any further. Okay, so likewise, we now come to the topic regarding the Qur'an, regarding those verses which are muhkam and those verses which are mutashabih. And what we're discussing here is a verse in Surah Al-Imran, Surah 3, verse 7, and the following verses, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that هُوَ الَّذِي أَنزَلَ عَلَيْكَ الْكِتَابِ, it is He who has sent down upon you, meaning Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the scripture, مِنْهُ آيَاتٌ مُحْكَمَاتٌ, amongst which are verses which are muhkamat. Okay, muhkamat. Okay, so there are amongst these verses sent down are ayat and muhkamat. Hunna umul kitab. These are the or the foundation, you might say, of the scripture. وَأُخَرُ مُتَشَابِهَاتٍ. And others are mutashabihat. Then Allah says, فَأَمَّا الَّذِينَ فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ زَيْغٌ فَيَتَّبِعُونَ مَا تَشَابَهَ مِنْهُ. As for those who have some perversion in their hearts, they follow that which is tashabah, or the mutashabah from it. ابتغاء الفتنة وابتغاء تأويله. Seeking to cause discord, fitna, and seeking its interpretation. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا يَعْلَمْ تَأْوِيلَهُ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. None knows its interpretation except for Allah. وَالرَّاسِخُونَ فِي الْعِلْمِ. And those who are well rooted in knowledge, يَقُولُونَ آمَنَّ بِهِ كُلٌّ مِنْ عِنْدَ رَبِّنَا. We believe in it all, it is all from our Lord. Okay. So what is the muhkam and what is the mutashabihat? Well, the argument in terms of determining what this is, regarding it is based upon, or it hinges upon how we're going to read the verse. Allah says in the verse, and none knows its interpretation or ta'wil but Allah, and those firmly rooted in knowledge say. Some scholars read the verse, and none knows its interpretation but Allah, stopping at this point. Full stop, period, all right? And those, so then the new sentence would start, and those firmly rooted in knowledge say, we believe in it all. It is all from our Lord. So based upon that reading of the text, they say the mutashabihat are those matters which Allah alone knows its meaning. And they stop. Right. And they start a new sentence, you might say, where it says, and though... I couldn't hear you, I'm sorry. Yeah, the same group of scholars stop there and they start a new sentence. And that new sentence they say, and those firmly rooted in knowledge say, we believe in it all. Okay? So based upon their stopping, and none knows its interpretation or ta'wil but Allah, period, based upon that group of scholars, then they therefore say the mutashabihat means those matters which Allah alone knows its meaning or its interpretation or its reality. And they give certain examples, among which would be, when is the day of judgment? Precisely. Another example would be, what is the reality of the matters in paradise and in hell? What is the reality of the divine attributes? Matters that go beyond the frame of the human intellect. What is the reality of the descriptions of the angels? Allah describes the angels as having wings. And so therefore they accept this. But exactly how those wings are. I mean, now if you talk about a bird's wing, right? A human can give much information about it, right? You can touch it, you can put it underneath a microscope, you can describe it, right? You talk about an airplane wing, right? You can look at it, so forth. What about an angel's wing? Huh? Ta'wil means, interpretation. Okay? So, ta'wil is synonymous with the word tafsir in the Qur'an. Okay, so that's one of the readings, okay? Now, there's another reading which says, let's move this period from, and none knows its interpretation but Allah, to, and those firmly rooted in knowledge. Let's put the period here. So none knows its interpretation but Allah, and those firmly rooted in knowledge know its interpretation. And if we accept this as a reading for the verse, then our definition of al-mutashabihat becomes those verses which are not explicit and apparently seem to be contradictory. At first glance, right? So an example would be when Allah refers to Himself as Nahnu, we. The word we, or Nahnu in the Arabic language, can refer to a group of people, like we can say Nahnu in terms of all of us collectively in this classroom, or sometimes it can refer to the singular when that individual is praising himself. And an example, especially for, since you all are British, would be when the Queen, right, says we, right, speaking of herself, right, but in a plural sense. So here, based upon that, in their understanding, the mutashabihat are those verses which are not explicit in meaning, and apparently might seem to be contradictory. Okay? That is, this, if we were to take the period and move it, and none knows its interpretation but Allah and those firmly rooted in knowledge. Yes? Yeah, in other words, okay, so here, then there would be, then the Arabic language allows that sometimes certain words are not mentioned, but the meaning of those words are implied. Okay? And so therefore, it would have the meaning as the believers say. Okay? Or those who do not seek fitna and do not seek its interpretation say. All right? It's implied in the text even though it's not. And the Arabic language allows for that type of flexibility. I mean, it doesn't need that every single word is mentioned. All right, but in terms of in a legal sense, how does that affect us? Well, if we take the first interpretation and we put the period over here, then there's no reason to try to interpret these mutashabihat, because only Allah knows its meaning, right? If we take the first, if we take the second interpretation of the verse, we move the period down here, then the scholars. And so then, therefore, in this case, we have to interpret these mutashabihat verses, these verses which are not explicit, in light of the verses which are muhkamat. Okay, let me repeat that. According to the first interpretation of the verse, those who, when they're reciting the verse, they stop at Allah. The issue of the interpretation of the mutashabihat is a non-issue, because for them only Allah knows those meanings. For those who stop at and those firmly rooted in knowledge, meaning they also know the interpretation of mutashabihat, then say, we need to, when we come across these verses which are mutashabihat, they are not explicit in meaning, they might apparently seem contradictory, we must then interpret them in light of those verses which are muhkamat, which are clear, in this case would be the clear, definite verses, which are the foundation of the book. And so therefore, according to that, when we come to the we, nahnu, and there's a possibility according to the Arabic language where you would have it meaning plural, right? Or a singular who is praising himself, okay? We would then interpret this in light of those clear verses, like قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ, say He is Allah alone. Is this discourse clear, this part? Okay, yes, please. No, I mean, why not accept both interpretations? That we can, some of the verses, right, only Allah knows its meaning of, and there are other verses which are mutashabihat in the sense that the meaning which is it's not explicit, and therefore should be interpreted in light of the muhkamat. I mean, why not accept both, and they're not contradictory, right? Huh? Just a second. I need to photocopy this for the class, though. Okay. Anyway, so the library or the office is closed, and but we have it over here now. And what will happen is when it opens up, we'll photocopy those pages regarding the compilation of the Qur'an, which you can stick in your notes. Okay. The incident I referred to about Uthman compiling the Qur'an, also the incident of Azerbaijan. You were saying something, brother. I'm sorry, I cut you off. Right. And if you look at this book, we're finally putting it to use now. Look on page 18 of your booklet. I know what happened. One sec. I'll come to you in a second. When we have right there on the top of page 18, equivocal and unequivocal text. Similar to this is the existence of equivocal muhkam and unequivocal mutashabih text. It is required to interpret the unequivocal text in the light of those which are equivocal. That's the rule. As long as you know that, you've got the lesson. Yes, brother. No, it doesn't mean that you leave the unclear verse. It means that you interpret the unclear in light of the clear. According to the second, one that puts the period over here, that means that the interpretation is known by Allah and those who are firmly rooted in knowledge. That's the first reading. The first reading puts the period here, and so therefore you would leave it. You would just believe it as it is without trying to delve into any meaning to it. But those who bring the period down here, right? That means the people firmly rooted in knowledge know its meaning. And so therefore we would interpret the mutashabihat in light of the muhkamat. Back there, yes. Yeah, or we can say we interpret the unclear in light of the clear. Okay. According to the second reading, which puts the period there. Yes, brother. No, because that would be contradictory. By them saying that, it comes over here and those firmly rooted in knowledge, right? Since Allah says those firmly rooted in knowledge knows its interpretation, because there must be some human beings who know their interpretation, right? Yes. Yes. Okay. Inshallah. Yeah. Okay. What we're talking about is Surah 3. Verse 7. Surah 3, verse 7. If somebody has a Qur'an to hand, the brother might help him to go along. Okay, read the verse for me. Just the English translation would be sufficient. Okay, don't bring the things in parentheses, but just go through. Yeah. Okay. Those which are entirely clear, skip over the parenthetical information. Okay, those are not entirely clear. Okay, then continue on. All right. All right, and seeking its. Okay, see that? Save Allah and those firmly grounded knowledge. So we're talking about over here. Okay, the translator, by translating ta'wil as hidden meaning, that's an incorrect translation, because ta'wil doesn't mean hidden meaning, it means interpretation. So, and none knows its interpretation, save Allah or but Allah, and those firmly rooted in knowledge. So the question, brother, is that, do we understand that the and over here means that none knows its interpretation, but Allah and those firmly rooted in knowledge? Or do we say that none knows its interpretation but Allah, period, new sentence, and those firmly rooted in knowledge say? Depending upon that, we would have one of two positions regarding those verses which are mutashabihat. If we say that those firmly rooted in knowledge know its meaning, then therefore we interpret the mutashabihat in light of the muhkamat. If we say that none knows its interpretation, then we say the mutashabihat is ininterpretable, and we just deal with the muhkamat.